What you are watching right now is not a news segment. It is not talking heads on cable television repeating the same three sentences until you fall asleep. This is something different. This is a real conversation about what is actually happening in the world right now, because what is unfolding between the United States and Iran at this very moment in May 2026 is one of the most dangerous and consequential geopolitical standoffs in the last 2 decades, and almost nobody in mainstream media is telling you the full story. A fragile ceasefire is hanging by a thread. Donald Trump himself has described that ceasefire as being on massive life support, and in the last 48 hours, Iran has threatened to enrich uranium to weapons-grade 90% purity if the United States resumes military strikes. Think about that for a moment. Not a rumor, not speculation. A direct public threat from inside the Iranian parliament, aimed squarely at Washington, saying we will go nuclear if you come at us again. That is the world we are living in right now. That is what you need to understand. So let us slow down and walk through this carefully, because the details here are everything. If you just read the headlines, you get noise. But if you actually sit with the sequence of events, the decisions made, the decisions avoided, and the deeper logic driving each side, then something very important becomes clear. This is not simply a story about Donald Trump and Iran. This is a story about what happens when the most powerful nation on earth, guided by a particular kind of political ego and strategic impatience, collides with a civilization that has survived empires for thousands of years and has absolutely no intention of surrendering its sense of national dignity. Let us go back to where this chain of events actually began to accelerate, because context is everything in geopolitics. 8 years after abandoning the 2015 nuclear deal that was effectively blocking Iran's path to a bomb, Trump dispatched his envoys to try to persuade Iran to permanently give up the option to enrich uranium or face another, possibly much larger, US attack. Now let us be very clear about what that means. The 2015 deal, the JCPOA, whatever you think of it politically, was a functioning arms control agreement. It had inspectors, it had caps, it had verified limitations. That agreement had capped Iranian enrichment at 3.67% and limited stockpiles to 300 kilograms for 15 years. Trump walked away from it in 2018, called it the worst deal ever, promised something better, and then, for years, nothing better came. What came instead was a predictable Iranian escalation. In November 2024, Iran said it would activate new and advanced centrifuges. The IAEA confirmed that Tehran had informed the nuclear watchdog that it planned to install more than 6,000 new centrifuges to enrich uranium. In December 2024, the IAEA said Iran was rapidly enriching uranium to 60% purity, moving closer to the 90% threshold needed for weapons-grade material. So when America pulled out of the deal, Iran did not just sit quietly. Iran enriched, Iran expanded, Iran built leverage. That is what states do when they feel cornered. That is what states do when they feel that diplomacy is being used not as a genuine negotiating tool, but as a pressure mechanism designed to strip them of their sovereign rights. Now here is where it gets more complicated, and I want you to really follow this thread because it matters enormously for understanding what is happening right now in May 2026. In April 2025, talks began again. On April 12, 2025, Iran and the United States began a series of negotiations aimed at reaching a nuclear peace agreement, following a letter from US President Donald Trump to Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Trump set a 60-day deadline for Iran to reach an agreement. A deadline. Think about that language. You do not set deadlines in diplomacy with sovereign nations unless you are either supremely confident of success or supremely indifferent to failure. And what happened when that deadline passed without an agreement? After the deadline passed without an agreement, Israel launched numerous strikes against Iran, igniting a war between the two countries. And then came the so-called 12-day war. The 12-day Israel-Iran conflict killed top Iranian military leaders and nuclear scientists, caused significant damage to Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure, and in its final days it involved US strikes on Iran's most important nuclear facilities. Trump went out and told the American public and the world that Iran's nuclear program had been obliterated. Finished, done. And at that moment, a lot of people breathed a sigh of relief and thought, well, at least the nuclear problem is solved. Except it was not solved. Not even close. Last June, Iran's enrichment program was severely degraded by US and Israeli strikes in what is now known as the 12-day war. Nuclear scientists were killed, and enrichment capacity at the country's underground Fordo and Natanz facilities was badly damaged or destroyed. Yet Iran's nuclear program still poses a greater challenge now than it did in 2015, when the last nuclear treaty was finalized. How is that possible, you might ask? How can a program that was supposedly obliterated still pose a greater challenge than before, because what you can bomb is infrastructure. What you cannot bomb is knowledge. What you cannot bomb is the institutional memory of thousands of Iranian scientists, engineers, and technicians who have spent decades building this program. You can set the calendar back. You cannot erase the calendar entirely. And then there is the question of the stockpile. This is arguably the most dangerous and least discussed element of this entire situation. Iran holds roughly 400 kilograms of enriched uranium, enriched to 60%, just below the 90% threshold for weapons-grade material. Washington regards this as a core concern. Iran has said its right to enrich uranium is non-negotiable, although it has indicated the level of enrichment is open for discussion. 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. Let me put that in plain language for you. Iran retains enough nuclear material, enriched to 60% capacity, for roughly 12 nuclear weapons if the regime decides to use its remaining nuclear facilities and know-how to sprint to weaponization. 12 nuclear weapons worth of material. And right now, nobody on the American side can definitively tell you where all of it is. Because a spokesman for Iran's military said its forces were on full readiness to protect nuclear sites where uranium is stored. They are guarding it, they know it is their most powerful bargaining chip, and they have absolutely no intention of just handing it over without getting something substantial in return. Now let us talk about what February 2026 brought, because this is where things went from dangerous to genuinely alarming. On 28 February 2026, Israel and the United States began a series of strikes against Iran. They said they aimed to induce regime change in the country and target its nuclear and ballistic missile program. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed in the strikes. The supreme leader of Iran killed in a US and Israeli military strike. Let that settle for a moment. That is one of the most extraordinary events in the history of Middle Eastern geopolitics, and yet in the American media landscape it was processed almost as routine, almost as something to be celebrated and moved past quickly. But the rest of the world did not move past it quickly. The rest of the world, particularly across the global south, across the Muslim world, across those nations that have spent decades watching American military power be deployed and redefined at will, took very careful note. Iran has appointed Khamenei's son as his successor and launched a series of counterstrikes against Israel, US military bases in the region, and military and civilian locations in Arab states. Among Iranian counteractions is closing the Strait of Hormuz, a major global trade route for goods including fuel and gas, the Strait of Hormuz. Now we are talking about something that directly touches every American's life, because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a geopolitical abstraction on a map, it is the channel through which roughly 20% of the world's traded oil passes. It is the narrow throat of the global energy economy. When Iran closes that strait, oil prices spike. When oil prices spike, everything gets more expensive. Gasoline, food, goods. Every American going to the pump or the grocery store is, in a very real sense, living downstream from decisions being made in Tehran and Washington right now. Trump rejected Iran's counter-proposal to end the 10-week war in the Middle East, calling it totally unacceptable, while Tehran vowed to never bow, prolonging a standoff that has choked the Strait of Hormuz and roiled global energy markets. And what exactly did Iran propose that was so unacceptable? Tehran proposed separate negotiations and offered to dilute some of its highly enriched uranium and transfer the rest to a third country, with a provision that it be returned if Washington exits any eventual deal. In other words, Iran said, we will move our uranium out, but only if you guarantee you will not walk away from the deal the way you walked away from the last deal. Given that Trump's entire nuclear legacy is defined by walking away from the last deal, that Iranian demand is not irrational, it is actually historically grounded. Now this brings us to the very latest development, the thing that has triggered the title of this conversation, the thing that should have every serious American paying close attention right now. Iranian parliamentary spokesman Ebrahim Rezai said that the country could enrich uranium up to 90% purity, a level considered weapons grade if Iran is attacked again. He posted this directly on X, publicly, deliberately. This is not a secret back-channel communication. This is Iran speaking directly to American power, to American public opinion, and to the world, saying, if you come at us again, we will cross the threshold. We will go for broke. And here is the thing you need to understand about that statement. It is not bluster for the sake of bluster. It is a calculated strategic signal. Iran is telling Washington and telling the international community that the pressure being applied is not breaking the regime, it is not producing surrender, It is producing radicalization of options. When you back a nation into a corner, when you bomb their facilities, kill their supreme leader, strangle their economy with sanctions, block their ports, and then demand that they simply dismantle their entire nuclear program while offering uncertain guarantees in return, the options that nation reaches for become more extreme, not less. This is not a justification of Iranian policy. It is an analysis of cause and effect. These are the predictable dynamics of coercive diplomacy taken too far. Tehran may conclude that its ability to disrupt the global economy via the Strait of Hormuz provides enough deterrence to begin quietly rebuilding its nuclear program. That is the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace making that assessment, not some fringe analyst. And they are right. Because what Iran has demonstrated over the course of this conflict is that it has real leverage over the global economy, and it has not been afraid to use it. The closure of the strait is not just a military move. It is a financial weapon. It is a message to every oil-importing nation in the world that the cost of allowing America to wage unlimited war in the Middle East is borne not just by the countries being bombed, but by every nation that depends on stable energy markets. That is an extraordinarily powerful message, and it is resonating. Let us also look at this from the perspective of what is actually being demanded of Iran at the negotiating table. The US position in 2025 and 2026 has been that Iran must conduct zero enrichment. Zero, not reduced enrichment, not monitored enrichment, not 3.67% enrichment, like under the old deal, zero. The US position is that Iran must either transfer its enriched uranium stockpiles abroad or halt enrichment for at least 20 years. Now, Iran's position is that enrichment is a sovereign right protected under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the same treaty Iran has signed and that the United States routinely cites when it wants to pressure other countries on nuclear issues. And here is the extraordinarily important detail that the American media consistently buries. In March 2025, Tulsi Gabbard, the US Director of National Intelligence, testified to Congress that the US continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. The Director of National Intelligence, the person whose job is literally to assess these threats, said in front of Congress that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon. Yet the American negotiating position demands that Iran completely dismantle its civilian enrichment program as if it were a weapons program. There is a profound contradiction there, and it is one that the Iranian side has not failed to notice. War has not softened Iran's insistence that it has a right to enrich, though the fact that it is not currently exercising this disputed right could create space for creative deal-making. That, however, would require concerted efforts from both parties, who currently seem more inclined to retrench in their maximalist positions. Maximalist positions. That is the phrase that keeps coming up in every serious analysis of this crisis. Both sides have staked out absolute positions. Trump has said Iran will not get a nuclear weapon under any circumstances. Iran has said its enrichment rights are non-negotiable. Netanyahu has said the war is not over while Iran holds highly enriched uranium, and Iran's parliament speaker has said Washington has no alternative but to accept Tehran's 14-point proposal or face failure. You have maximalism colliding with maximalism, and the gap between those positions is not closing, it is widening. Some aides say Trump is now more seriously considering a resumption of major combat operations than at any point in recent weeks. And retired U.S. Army General H.R. McMaster, who served as National Security Advisor during Trump's first term, said he expects renewed American attacks on Iran, suggesting escalation is more likely than a durable diplomatic settlement. When the former National Security Advisor, a man who knows how these decisions are actually made inside the White House, says escalation is more likely than a deal, that is not a hot take. That is a considered assessment from someone with deep institutional knowledge of how American military and foreign policy decisions get made at the highest levels. And yet here is what makes this situation even more complex, even more layered than the simple war or peace binary that the media presents. It is still in the US national interest to find a diplomatic solution to the Iranian nuclear threat. But what worked in 2015 is no longer enough. That is from Foreign Affairs, one of the most sober and establishment-oriented foreign policy publications in the United States. And they are absolutely correct. The world of 2015 is gone, the strategic situation has changed, Iran's program has advanced, the regional dynamics have shifted, Israel's security calculations have evolved, and the credibility of American diplomatic commitments is at an all-time low after 2 withdrawals from Iranian nuclear agreements in less than a decade. Any deal that gets done in 2026 has to be substantially different from anything attempted before, and it has to come with credible guarantees, which is precisely the thing that the Trump administration has the hardest time providing because its core identity is defined by walking away from agreements made by previous administrations. As of May 7th, the United States and Iran, via Pakistani mediators, were formulating a one-page 14-point memo on parameters for ending the war. The memo calls on Iran to commit to a moratorium on nuclear enrichment. President Trump threatened to resume bombing if Iran did not accept the deal. One page, 14 points. That is the document standing between the current fragile ceasefire and renewed war. And yet even that minimal framework is collapsing because Iran's response was called totally unacceptable, and Trump is reportedly meeting with his national security team to discuss resumed strikes. Here is the deeper geopolitical picture that I want you to hold in your mind, because it connects this Iran situation to something much larger. What you are watching in 2026 is the fundamental tension at the heart of American foreign policy. The tension between the aspiration to control outcomes in every corner of the world and the actual limitations of military power as a tool for producing lasting political change. You can bomb Iran's nuclear facilities, you already did, twice in the span of less than a year, and yet the nuclear question is still unresolved. You can kill Iran's supreme leader, and yet Iran has a new supreme leader, a new hardened resolve, and now a direct threat to enrich to weapons grade. The June 2025 US attacks severely damaged Iran's major uranium enrichment facilities, but not its resolve to retain a nuclear program or its nuclear know-how. Resolve and knowledge are not targets that can be destroyed by bombs. That is the central lesson that American foreign policy keeps learning and then forgetting. There is also the economic dimension to this that deserves far more attention than it typically gets. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening in a global economy that is already stressed by years of pandemic disruption, supply chain fractures, inflationary pressure, and the compounding uncertainties of a world transitioning away from the old unipolar order. Oil has stayed highly sensitive to headlines, with markets caught between hopes of de-escalation and the risk that sporadic clashes keep an energy risk premium embedded in forex exchange and rates. Every day the strait remains effectively closed or under threat, that premium sits in the price of energy globally. American consumers pay it, European consumers pay it, Asian consumers pay it. The developing world, which has the least capacity to absorb these shocks, pays it most of all. And consider what this does to the long-term credibility of the United States as a guarantor of global stability. When the Biden administration attempted to re-enter the JCPOA and failed, and when the Trump administration then abandoned the 2015 agreement and launched military operations, every nation watching these events drew a very clear conclusion. American commitments are conditional. American agreements can be reversed by the next election cycle. American military power can be deployed without reliable constraints. That conclusion drives proliferation. That conclusion encourages countries that feel threatened by American power to seek nuclear deterrence, because nuclear deterrence is the one thing that has historically prevented American military intervention. North Korea has it, Pakistan has it, Russia and China have it, and Iran looks at that landscape and draws its own conclusions about what ultimate security requires. The 14-point memo being negotiated through Pakistani mediators represents the last chance to avoid resumed conflict in the near term. Iran has said its right to enrich uranium is non-negotiable, although it has indicated the level of enrichment is open for discussion. That is actually a crack in the wall if anyone is willing to look through it. Iran is signaling that while it will not accept zero enrichment as a principle, it may be willing to negotiate on the practical question of how much enrichment, at what level, under what supervision. Some formulas, such as a multi-year suspension, could in theory bridge the gap, but the central problem is that the administration cannot credibly offer meaningful sanctions relief, which in turn makes Iran less willing to show flexibility on enrichment. That is the core structural problem. Sanctions relief is the currency of this negotiation. But to offer credible sanctions relief, you need a political will to honor that commitment over time, across administrations, across political cycles. And right now, the world does not believe that America has that capacity to commit. So where does this leave us? It leaves us watching a ceasefire that is, by the president's own description, on massive life support. It leaves us with an Iranian nuclear threat that was supposedly obliterated but is functionally alive because the knowledge and the stockpile both remain. It leaves us with a diplomatic process that has produced a 14-point memo and a pile of public accusations rather than a binding agreement. And it leaves us with both sides hardening their positions at precisely the moment when flexibility is the only thing that prevents a return to active combat. which, given the stakes of what that combat could trigger, should terrify every reasonable person who is paying attention. The American public deserves to know what is actually at stake in this situation, not the sanitized version, not the triumphalist framing that presents every military action as a decisive victory and every failed negotiation as someone else's fault. The real version, which is this: a country that has 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, with the knowledge to take it to 90% in weeks, is now threatening to do exactly that if pressed further. A ceasefire brokered by Pakistan is the only thing separating the region from renewed war, and the man in the Oval Office, who has described that ceasefire as being on life support, is simultaneously meeting with his national security team about resumed bombing. The decisions made in the next few days and weeks will echo for decades. That is not an exaggeration. That is the honest description of the moment we are in. What you are watching right now is not a news segment. It is not talking heads on cable television repeating the same 3 sentences until you fall asleep. This is something different. This is a real conversation about what is actually happening in the world right now, because what is unfolding between the United States and Iran at this very moment in May 2026 is one of the most dangerous and consequential geopolitical standoffs in the last 2 decades, and almost nobody in mainstream media is telling you the full story. A fragile ceasefire is hanging by a thread. Donald Trump himself has described that ceasefire as being on massive life support, and in the last 48 hours, Iran has threatened to enrich uranium to weapons-grade 90% purity if the United States resumes military strikes. Think about that for a moment. Not a rumor, not speculation. A direct public threat from inside the Iranian parliament, aimed squarely at Washington, saying we will go nuclear if you come at us again. That is the world we are living in right now. That is what you need to understand. So let us slow down and walk through this carefully, because the details here are everything. If you just read the headlines, you get noise. But if you actually sit with the sequence of events, the decisions made, the decisions avoided, and the deeper logic driving each side, then something very important becomes clear. This is not simply a story about Donald Trump and Iran. This is a story about what happens when the most powerful nation on earth, guided by a particular kind of political ego and strategic impatience, collides with a civilization that has survived empires for thousands of years and has absolutely no intention of surrendering its sense of national dignity. Let us go back to where this chain of events actually began to accelerate, because context is everything in geopolitics. 8 years after abandoning the 2015 nuclear deal that was effectively blocking Iran's path to a bomb, Trump dispatched his envoys to try to persuade Iran to permanently give up the option to enrich uranium or face another, possibly much larger, US attack. Now let us be very clear about what that means. The 2015 deal, the JCPOA, whatever you think of it politically, was a functioning arms control agreement. It had inspectors, it had caps, it had verified limitations. That agreement had capped Iranian enrichment at 3.67% and limited stockpiles to 300 kilograms for 15 years. Trump walked away from it in 2018, called it the worst deal ever, promised something better, and then, for years, nothing better came.